as we talked about, the event is called 2024 Cloud Compliance Summit, Level Up and Scale with FedRAMP. But that said, as I'll talk about throughout the talk, there'll be topics that are going to expand beyond any single compliance framework, beyond FedRAMP, beyond any federal agency or so on, and apply in the commercial space as well. My name is Chris Hughes. I'm the president and co-founder at Aquia. We'll be talking about our company throughout the talk a little bit here and there, but by way of background, I've been in the federal space almost 20 years. I was active duty Air Force. I was a federal civilian with the Navy, NAVIC Atlantic, doing cloud and DevSecOps. I've also been a federal employee with GSA on the FedRAMP team as one of the technical SMEs there. And as I mentioned, now co-founder and president at Aquia. You'll hear a lot about FedRAMP today. Just a little bit of a disclaimer, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but I don't represent FedRAMP or the PMO or GSA, neither do any of the other speakers here, with the exception of the one that's actually coming from GSA, of course. So just get that out there, out the gate. We want to give a thanks to some of our partners as well, DataLock Consulting Group, Imagine IT, and Orange Slices. We really appreciate their support and presence here at the event today. For folks that want to dive into like Ask the Experts, get into technical topics, ask certain questions and so on, room 3, 106 across the hall is going to have folks in it all day that can dive into solution architects, folks from AWS, folks from Aquia. They're going to be diving into technical topics, architecture, compliance, expertise, and so on. So feel free to swing over there if you'd like. A little bit about me, as I mentioned, here, co-founder, president at Aquia, a published author. I've put a couple books out about software supply chain security, and I have another one coming out about vulnerability management in May. I serve currently as a cyber innovation fellow at CISA, focused on software supply chain and vulnerability management as well. Father of 4, and I told you a little bit about my background already, so I won't rehash that. For folks that aren't familiar, this is going to be a bit of a recap, so if you are familiar with FedRAMP, you know a lot of this already. But FedRAMP was originally established in 2011, and the goal was to provide a cost-effective, risk-based approach, for a standardized approach of cloud adoption across the federal ecosystem. Rather than having every agency have its own duplicative process, putting the CSPs through the process over and over again, it's not efficient, it's not standardized, it's hard to, kind of have a level set of risk assurance across the federal ecosystem if you have that kind of approach. So it was, initially stood up to have that standardized approach across the federal government. And, we are now over a decade in the FedRAMP. So we'll be talking about some of the pros, some of the cons, some of the gaps, and so on. As I talked about, the benefits are, reducing those duplicative efforts. Every agency having to go through the process over and over again, put the CSP through the process over and over again to get an authorization. You can streamline that, have one agency get an ATO for a CSP or, the gap, for example, and get reciprocity across other agencies is one of the goals. Inconsistencies in cost and the process. Again, every agency has its own way of doing things. There's obviously cost and efficiencies of everyone doing it themselves. And then have more of a public-private partnership. So we can drive innovation from the commercial sector, from those cloud service providers, to the federal agencies, and the agencies they're looking to use these innovative technologies to, improve citizen outcomes, national security, you name it, depending on the use case. It also enabled the federal government to accelerate the adoption of cloud computing. I remember, back when this program started, and even years since then, and still now in some agencies, there's even in the security community, people don't trust the cloud, they don't feel comfortable with the cloud, we can't see it, we can't touch it. FedRAMP, fixed a lot of that in the sense of having a transparent process. You get insight into, disaster recovery, business continuity, incident response. How are these CSPs doing these things? Providing that transparency to us as a federal agency or a consumer in the federal ecosystem to understand those things. It also improved the way that we secure and authorize cloud technologies. As I said, there's a standardized way of doing it. We're looking for certain controls, from NIST and so on. We know what the cloud service provider is or isn't doing, where their gaps are, what inefficiencies they're looking to address via POAMs and so on. And then looking to build more rapport, with the FedRAMP stakeholders, who I'll talk about here in a moment. So as I talked about, it's trying to standardize that government-wide approach, for security assessments. Anyone who's done a lot of ATO work at agencies know that it's always a little bit different at each agency, or in the federal space versus defense community and so on. And it avoid that duplicative toil and lack of standardization. CSPs have to go through the process many times and costing a lot of time and a lot of money. Same for the agencies that are looking to do this work as well. If they can lean into someone else who's already done this at another agency, have that artifact body of evidence and so on, it can streamline that process and save the government time and the CSP time and money. So some of the key stakeholders, many of you are already familiar with this, but for folks that are not, some of the key stakeholders, obviously they're federal agencies, whether you're talking federal civilian, Department of Defense, and so on. The cloud service providers, obviously, there's the big infrastructure as a service providers like AWS, who are graciously enough, hosting us today. But there's obviously hundreds and thousands of others of cloud service providers, SaaS-based providers, for example, in the ecosystem, who have an interest and a stake in FedRAMP being successful. There's the assessor community. You often hear it as a 3PAO, a third-party assessor, that's going to come in and assess the cloud service provider, look at their artifacts, look at the way they do things, their processes, their architecture, and so on, and give that assurance to the federal government as a consumer of these technologies. You have what's called the FedRAMP board, previously called the JAB, the Joint Authorization Board, and that consists of folks from GSA, OMB, and DHS. And those folks come in and they kind of make governance decisions for FedRAMP as a program, as well as authorizing CSPs in a centralized fashion. You also have Office of Management and Budget, the CIO Council, NIST. If you've ever worked with FedRAMP or even federal agencies, you know that NIST, they use the 853, the security control baselines for FedRAMP. Low, moderate, and high authorization baselines are based on NIST. And then recently there was what was stood up called the Federal Secure Cloud Advisory Committee, or FSAT. I'm not going to try that one, but yes, you see the acronym there. We love our acronyms. So a little bit of notable milestones of the FedRAMP program for folks that aren't familiar with the program, or where it was, or where it is now, and where it's headed. Government established its kind of cloud-first approach in 2011, so we're over a decade from that now. Initially, anyone that worked in cloud or at the government at that time remembers it was just lift and shift, like just get it in the cloud as quickly as you can. And I think we quickly realized it's inefficient, it's insecure, it's not the best way to do it. Garbage in, garbage out. Just moving something to the cloud doesn't make it better necessarily, or more efficient, more scalable, and so on. And then we started to shift, several years later, to what's called Cloud Smart, is where we are now, is looking at the workloads and saying what makes sense to move to the cloud, what makes sense but maybe needs to be re-architected, or maybe we have hybrid cloud scenarios, or we have multi-cloud scenarios. So those considerations are something that has kind of matured as the organizations and industries in the federal ecosystem kind of matured in their understanding of cloud and how it works, and lessons learned throughout those 7 years. Believe it or not, despite being around for over a decade, FedRAMP was actually never codified into law until 2022, so fairly recently. Over a decade of existing and being kind of the standard way of taking cloud services into the federal market, it actually wasn't law. It got codified in law in fiscal year 2023 underneath what's called the National Defense Authorization Act. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment. And then, there's no shortage of criticism of the FedRAMP program and the way it does things, both from the cloud service providers, the 3PAOs, and the agencies themselves. Everyone have pain points associated with FedRAMP. And we recently saw what's called the FedRAMP Modernization Memo released. And I'll be diving into some of the specifics of that, the ways that they're looking to innovate the FedRAMP program, address inefficiencies and gaps, make it more successful for both the CSPs and the agencies looking to take CSPs through the process. And then most recently, this year actually, they published what's called the Emerging Technology Prioritization Framework. And this is focused on certain technologies that are really innovative and really promising. And we want to kind of jump the hurdle of getting them through FedRAMP, for example, or maybe put them to the front of the line or have them prioritized in some sense. Most notably, think of things like Gen AI, for example. Agencies are looking to use Gen AI. There's been a GAO report that hundreds of use cases of Gen AI and LLMs across the federal ecosystem. And if we're theoretically supposed to be using FedRAMP cloud services, it's going to be hard to do that if none of them are actually in the FedRAMP marketplace. So trying to prioritize those things through the FedRAMP process is what the Emerging Technologies Framework is about. So some of the key takeaways from the FedRAMP Authorization Act. This is what I talked about for the 2023 NDAA. It codified the FedRAMP program into law. It reaffirmed those stakeholders that we talked about, the FedRAMP PMO, Joint Authorization Board, OMB, and others. It also emphasized the roles of these various entities, what role they play formally now that the program is actually codified into law, more structured, more formal. And also it authorized annual appropriations for the FedRAMP PMO and the JAB. Believe it or not, as I talked about, there's no shortage of issues with FedRAMP in terms of problems and struggles and inefficiencies and pain points, but the program never actually had annual appropriations, formally committed to it until this act passed, which is kind of hard to believe given that so many people in the federal ecosystem depend on this program. It also required GAO to report to Congress on the inefficiencies and effectiveness of the FedRAMP program, data on authorizations in terms of timelines and metrics and costs and so on, And what's really interesting, if you want to go check it out, is the GAO actually produced their first report on this, showing the timelines for authorizations, showing the average cost, showing what agencies are primarily taking CSPs through the process. So all those metrics are out in a report right now from GAO that you can go check out. And I'll tell you, it varies wildly. The costs can go from what seems low to what seems incredibly expensive and unbelievable in some cases. And that's probably due to many factors, delays on the CSP side, delays on the agency side, a lot of factors at play right there. And of course, it established the Federal Secure Cloud Advisory Committee, the acronym that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. So you can go check out that organization. It's a group of industry leaders, from the commercial side as well as federal agencies who have deep expertise in not just FedRAMP, but cloud security, cloud compliance, and things like that to try to drive efficiencies and improvements in the program. So next we have the FedRAMP modernization memo that I talked about. And this one, some key takeaways from this is trying to address some of those longstanding pain points associated with FedRAMP, making it more efficient, more cost-effective, make the assessments and authorizations more standardized, because each 3PAO may have its own process. Each agency may have its own process. Ironically enough, some of the very things that FedRAMP set out to address originally. And then we talked about the costs and timelines. Many people in industry will say it's too costly, or it's too cumbersome, or too expensive to go through this process. I can't afford it as a small business. How do we address that to kind of expand that net of cloud service providers that can come into the federal ecosystem? It also looks to refine what's known as CONMON, or continuous monitoring. You get a FedRAMP authorization, you might think, oh, I'm good, I'm done. Not necessarily. You still have what's called continuous monitoring. Typically, that's done on an annual basis. It's very static in nature traditionally, and I'll be talking about that here coming up in a moment. Trying to refine that to make it more dynamic, more aligned with the way that cloud and the threat landscape operate. And it's also looking to improve the customer experience of FedRAMP. Many people have experienced pain of working with the FedRAMP PMO or the agency sponsor and so on, of going through the FedRAMP process. It doesn't make a good experience for the cloud service provider or the federal buyer that's looking to use that cloud service provider in many cases. So it's looking to address all of these things in that modernization memo. So give that a read, and we'll see where the program is headed. Some of the key innovations and focus areas that they're looking to improve on. Last up is going to be the emerging technology prioritization framework. I talked about this one a little bit. It's actually a result of an executive order 14110, which is an executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI. So again, you see that AI emphasis in the executive order. As part of that GSA, where the FedRAMP PMO resides, was kind of directed basically to go out and prioritize these innovative technologies like LLM and Gen AI to get through the FedRAMP process. Because if we don't, we're going to have this dichotomy where either agencies can't get access to these innovative technologies and make use of them to improve citizen services or national security and so on, or they're going to do it without the assurance of FedRAMP, and they're just going to start using these things. Shadow IT, but in the cloud, shadow SaaS, for example. Which we know is pervasive across the ecosystem. And so FedRAMP published their Emerging Technologies Prioritization Framework just earlier this year, a couple months ago, and it dives into how they're going to go about, prioritizing certain technologies, how they're going to improve, getting things through the pipeline that is FedRAMP to become FedRAMP authorized. And it talks about certain technologies they're targeting, like I talked about Gen AI and LLM, but also chat interfaces or code generation tools, things that can improve, development velocity and security, security tooling as well, image generators, and various use cases like this. They're trying to prioritize these technologies for federal agencies. And it's looking basically to get the most important technologies into the government's hand. And this is going to be a theme I'll be talking about here in a moment too, is, we have a situation where compliance has become an impediment to getting access to innovative technologies and driving, secure outcomes and promising outcomes for the federal government. And that shouldn't be the case. So this is where I'm going to go beyond FedRAMP. And you'll hear a lot of people talk today about various topics. And everyone who's been in the industry for some time knows about DevOps, agile software delivery, iterative software development, and so on. Many people can argue that, kind of compliance missed the bus on that. Everything is ephemeral, dynamic, as code, API-centric, cloud-native, and compliance still lives in spreadsheets, Excel, static documentation, snapshot-in-time compliance type activities. So this is much broader than just FedRAMP or any single compliance framework. As the industry has shifted to DevOps and DevSecOps, we failed to keep pace in the compliance community. And many times it's a workforce challenge. You spend all your time in Excel or a GRC tool. You don't really understand Kubernetes and cloud and automation and APIs. So that's a problem. But also, we just simply haven't kept up with the way things are working now. The way developers operate, the way software gets written and delivered to production. Everything is kind of snapshot in time. I like to give this snapshot in time analogy because I have 4 kids. The way we do compliance right now or continuous monitoring is like I say, hey, get your room clean. I come check, and then it's good, right? I just check a year later, it's good. In that time, it'll be clean. That's how we treat compliance, and that's not how the risk landscape works. It's changing, it's dynamic, it's ephemeral, it's always evolving, and compliance really doesn't operate that way, and it needs to. And it's often why we hear the term, compliance doesn't equal security. Because to be honest with you, the way we operate, it doesn't. That's why that paradigm, that's why that phrase exists. Everything is very static documents, artifacts. We do a lot of sampling or subsets of systems. It's not practical to go out and manually evaluate 300 systems. So we're just going to look at a subset of those, look at 100 of them. But the adversary is looking at all of them. They don't care which ones you sampled or which ones you took as a subset. And it often neglects software supply chain threats too, things like SaaS security or open source software and so on. So we're trying to drive compliance in a direction to catch up with DevOps and DevSecOps and make compliance, bridge that gap between compliance and security. So as I talked about, in a world right now where code is deployed in minutes and hours, compliance moves in months and years. We don't operate at the speed of modern software development, and it's impeding the way that agencies and cloud, the industry as well. This is a problem beyond just the government. The way that software operates right now. These threats are dynamic; they're not static. The threat is always changing. Systems are ephemeral. They're coming up, coming down. Static IP addresses are no longer kind of the way to approach things in many cases. And they don't just attack subsets of systems. They're attacking any system, any weakness you have. So that legacy approach of subsets of system and sampling systems and using static documentation, it doesn't work like that. We've seen a situation right now where the industry has shifted to what's called infrastructure as code. You can now dynamically declare infrastructure, spin it up in an automated fashion, tear it down in an automated fashion. But documentation, the way we write documentation, and then we have some folks that just walked in from NIST and other Cloud Security Alliance and others who are going to talk about this a little bit later. But they're trying to shift that paradigm to compliance as code, documentation as code, moving to the way that DevOps operates. And that's where we're headed with compliance right now. So in a world that's driven by APIs and automation, we're still doing everything manually, tedious, and it's not scalable, and it's not secure, and it's not effective. There's little continuous about the way we do Kanban right now, other than it's continually ineffective and painful. So there's something to be said about GRC platforms. We talked a lot about the cloud service providers, the assessors, the people that are in the weeds on these technologies. But all of these artifacts that we're generating and storing and looking at, they often reside in what's called a governance, risk, and compliance platform. If you're in the federal defense market, for example, you've heard the word EMAS, and you probably feel really, really warmly about that great system. And then you likely have worked in the federal civilian space with Exact, RSA Archer, some other platforms that are really notable and used across the federal landscape. It's a little bit more diverse than the defense market. And same thing on the commercial side. We actually store these artifacts somewhere. We store all these compliance artifacts and findings and so on somewhere. So what roles do the GRC platforms play? You work in this space. You've done governance, risk, and compliance. You're using these platforms. It's used to store artifacts, store evidence, capture control findings, capture deficiencies among controls. But these legacy GRC platforms struggle from the same way that we talked about with the workforce and the way we approach compliance overall. It often doesn't integrate with the cloud service, the cloud environment or cloud service offerings. So you're not able to leverage cloud native technologies and automation. It's often not API centric. So you have to manually upload these artifacts in, manually pull these artifacts out. You can't streamline that process and automate the way you ingest evidence or ingest findings into these platforms. They're not often oriented around CI/CD workflows. So think about developers working in GitLab, GitHub. They're pushing things through pipelines. They're using all kinds of tools like SAST and DAST and so on. All those findings have to be manually compiled and manually uploaded into some GRC platform somewhere. And that's just simply not scalable when software is being written in hours and pushed out on a daily basis to manually have these kind of workflows. So there's a lack of automation, a lack of efficiency. And even GSA themselves put out solicitation recently focused on a GRC solution to try to improve the FedRAMP process and FedRAMP program. We talked about the FedRAMP modernization memo. You can likely suspect that this looking for a new GRC platform is likely part of that process to modernize the way that they do FedRAMP, for example. Many agencies are looking at similar GRC platforms. You'll hear from some of them today, some of the industry leaders out here who are driving that space and trying to disrupt the status quo. I look forward to those talks, and you should as well. But it's difficult or impossible to modernize GRC without modernizing the platforms that we put all these artifacts in, all the evidence in, and modernize the way we work, integrating closely with the cloud environment, the pipelines, the tooling, and so on. It's not just a problem in the federal ecosystem either. It's also pervasive among the DoD, Department of Defense. This is literally just an article from last week. This is a headline: legacy ATO process is slowing software upgrades at DoD and putting national security at risk, is what the article talked about. And believe it or not, I never thought I'd see the day come, but in the article, it quotes testimony from a retired Navy SEAL who's now talking about the ATO process. I didn't think I'd see Navy SEAL and ATO meet. Maybe I feel a little cooler about what we do for a living. But here we are. Like, they're starting to address the fact that compliance and ATO processes as they stand now, and the way we do things, the technologies we use, are putting national security at risk. So it's a big problem. It's not just a pain in the butt. It's an actual security risk, an actual risk to our economic prosperity, and so on. So it moves beyond just a single compliance framework. It applies in the Department of Defense, the federal civilian agencies, SOC 2, HIPAA, HITRUST, you name it. Like, this is a problem across the compliance ecosystem. So a lot of the talks you'll hear today talk about that, beyond just the federal community or beyond the defense community. So it's impeding the adoption of cloud-native innovation and technologies, like I talked about Gen AI and LLM. If these technologies can't be used at scale, they can't be authorized fast enough for us to consume, it's going to impede our ability to drive those secure outcomes or provide better services to our citizens or protect our critical infrastructure better, and so on. So we don't want compliance to impede that. And often, I feel like in the security community here, we have a problem where business risk is neglected in the name of compliance. Like, if we're more focused on compliance and checking the boxes than thinking about the risk of business. We only think about risk from a cybersecurity perspective. What about the risk of failing to keep up with foreign adversaries and nations? What about the risk of citizens losing trust in our government services because they're inefficient and broken and ineffective or unreliable? Or if you're in the business landscape, what about keeping up with your business peers? Like, there's a competitive risk. So compliance and cybersecurity can't be the only risk that we talk about, and we can't let compliance kind of impede that outcome. At the same time, though, we're dealing with a growing complexity in a compliance landscape. For example, people who are tracking the cybersecurity community or compliance closely, it's evolving rapidly. There's a lot more compliance requirements coming, and if we keep doing the things that we do traditionally the way we have done them, it's going to become more problematic, harder to keep up than it already is. For example, we've seen the Security and Exchange Commission publish rules around cybersecurity disclosures. Within 48 hours of determining an incident is material to the company, you have to go out there and now file an 8K to disclose that. If you're doing that in a paper-based, static way, that's going to be a problem. We've seen organizations, from the federal landscape, we see that FedRAMP got codified into law, so it's not going away. We should figure out how to do this better instead of doing it the way we've always done it. If you're in the defense industrial base, they have something called CMMC. It's an evolution of 871 from NIST. And this is dealing with all the hundreds of thousands of companies that do work with the Department of Defense. They now have to provide evidence and artifacts and findings about their cybersecurity and compliance posture as well. If you're in the federal ecosystem and you're selling software, there's something called the Cybersecurity Executive Order. Just today, or this week, I should say, CISA put out a repository where you're going to have to start going and making these self-attestations saying, yes, I'm following this secure software development framework. We have certain practices and methodologies and tools in place to ensure that the products that we're selling you as the federal government are developed securely. And if that's done in a static way with PDFs and manual uploads, like we do compliance, it's going to be a problem. We also see talk for software liability. If you look at the latest national cybersecurity strategy, there's a big emphasis on shifting that liability from consumers and customers to software suppliers, companies that produce software. So that's going to be another aspect of the compliance landscape. And then we've even seen an uptick in not just litigation against CISOs who maybe make false claims or inaccurate claims and disclosures or publicly and so on, but also false claims from companies who said, or organizations, it's happened to a couple of universities actually, that said, yeah, we're following, NIST 871. We have all these things in place, but there's a risk of not being accurate with that or truthful. And if you have, a manual way of doing compliance, you don't have APIs, you're not looking at the pipeline, you're not looking at cloud, et cetera, it's going to be hard to make these attestations and these claims accurately and truthfully. And you're putting yourself at a risk of, being in a legal litigation situation, for example. So I want to throw this in. I published this article. It's like 4 years now, I think, 4 years ago, on a site called Pluralsight. It was actually called A Cloud Guru at the time. It's a training site for cloud technologies. And my headline was, compliance is cumbersome, but cloud can help. It's been 4 years. And in that article, I talk about infrastructure as code, automation, APIs, all the things I just talked about. But 4 years later, we're still doing it the same way. Not much has changed. Like, we're really not making much progress. And, the industry, our development peers, our engineering peers, they're making leaps and bounds of progress and leaning into innovative technologies and automation. But we're still doing things the same way, primarily static, primarily snapshot in time type approach. And we often hear, compliance is a security. And if you're in this community and you work in compliance, as a lot of us do, like, that kind of bothers me. I hate hearing that because, like, it hurts to know that that's true. Like, that is the case. And the reason is because of that gap between the way that the world operates right now when it comes to software delivery and development and the way we operate with the way we do compliance. So if we want to bridge that gap, we need to innovate. All the things I just talked about, automation, APIs, and integrating with the cloud environment, moving away from snapshot legacy processes. So we need to bridge that gap to address that phrase. Now, so this talk, these talks today are going to be about bringing GRC into the modern era. It's going to be a bit of FedRAMP focus, but also going beyond that to other frameworks. I just talked about SOC 2, HIPAA, high trust, and you name it, you keep going. You're going to hear from cloud service provider, SMEs, you're going to hear from GRC platform providers, you're going to hear from experts who are innovating in this space and securing the cloud environments. So you're going to hear from all these folks today. And ultimately, the goal that we talked about, you saw from the defense quote there, is getting these technologies and capabilities into the user's hands faster. So we're actually impeding, business outcomes or national security or economic, prosperity and competitiveness due to the way we do compliance. So it's about addressing that and getting these capabilities into folks' hands faster. And understand that compliance doesn't have to be cumbersome if we're willing to, change the way that we operate, the way that we do things. So that's it for this talk. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active in that community, or shoot me an email if you'd like. Next up, we actually have folks, Shante Singletary from CMS, Will Lindsay and Khalid from Aquia that will be talking about FedRAMP from the government's perspective. Don't forget there's the Ask Experts session across the room in room 106 if you want to dive into any technical topics with folks or compliance topics and so on. So that'll be it for me, and then these folks will be up next. Yeah, any questions? I'm happy to take a question. Kill some time. Yeah.
So I'm here with Central.
I know who you guys are.
FedRAMP PAO.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you. Thank you. I wasn't expecting the mic. Testing. Okay. So Chris, as a FedRAMP 3 PAO, what you mentioned, you posed the question that compliance isn't security. And I really agree with that. But I also struggle with this responsibility as 3 PAOs to practice due diligence in our assessments, recognizing that gap between compliance and security. What do you believe that we should be doing to mitigate that gap, to better assess organizations, or is it just the cause of a faulty framework?
So I don't like to blame the frameworks. Like you saw me mention software liability up there. Like in my opinion, in the absence of compliance, we would be doing even less security. Like, it's a forcing function for organizations that simply don't want to do security in many cases. And I see I have a rebuttal or a comment coming, I think, in a moment. But the compliance acts as a forcing function to get organizations to operate in a way of having some standardized way of doing security, some standardized way of approaching security. Certain things like incident response, business continuity, secure software development, and so on. So it kind of forces organizations to do some of that rigor and governance they might not do traditionally. That said, I think there is a lot of opportunity to improve the way we do assessments and things like that to make it a more painless experience for the engineers and development teams that we interact with, or the cloud service providers and so on, by leaning into technologies and new methodologies of the way we do it. But I don't think that it's something that should just be thrown out. In the lack of it, I imagine security would be even worse than it is now. And then I'm curious to hear from Dr. Michaela Iorga of NIST.
Michaela Iorga, NIST. I think that the core element that we are discussing here today is compliance. So can we define compliance so we all understand the concept. What do you think people are understanding when they are hearing the word compliance and are complaining that compliance is not security? And then I'll give you my perspective.
Yeah, I
What do
guess
you think? Not that what you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't own the authoritative definition, but I think of compliance as like a standardized way of doing a base level amount of security and governance over technologies and organizations. And the reason I don't like that phrase, security doesn't equal compliance or compliance doesn't equal security, is like we all know that no system, no organization is infallible. It doesn't matter how many controls you have or how perfect you do everything. There's always an opportunity for an incident. So it kind of like tries to undermine compliance by saying, hey, they had a SOC 2 and they got breached, or they had a FedRAMP. Like that doesn't mean that your system and your organization is impenetrable and will never be compromised. But it does mean that as an ecosystem, whether it's SOC 2 or high trust or whatever your vertical is and so on, you have a standardized set of controls that every organization is rallying around that you agree are important. And I think that's how I think of it.
So I'm going to try to translate what you just said.
Please do, yeah.
A little bit. So everybody knows that NIST is developing 853 and it has 3 baselines. For a lot of subject matter experts, compliance means I categorize my system. It's a moderate system. I'm taking the entire moderate baseline and that's my Bible. Mm-hmm. The guidance that is coming from NIST is not that. That is, as you highlighted, is a minimum security, but your responsibility is to apply a risk management approach. So you start there, but you should go up if you need additional security safeguards, or you can tailor down to not waste resources, to not waste money. I apologize, Mom. Oh, be careful. Yeah. So because we are going to continue today discussing compliance, to me, if you'll hear me saying something around compliance, that's the approach. Did you do your due diligence? Did you employ a risk management approach? And are you assessing that you accomplished what you wanted?
Yeah, I actually shared
in that context.
I shared that DoD ATO article, and I talked about how like compliance isn't the problem. It's people's misunderstanding of it or the way we apply it. You're getting at risk management, risk tolerance, tailoring controls based on your organization's risk appetite. Right. That's the mature way of doing compliance, and it's often not done. They just take this baseline and they just use it without considering what's our risk posture or our tolerance or our appetite. What threats are we facing? They don't think about that. They just use whatever is there, and they don't think about going up or down, or they just use it as the Bible, as you said.
So if anyone goes on Google engine and searches NIST compliance, I was looking for a definition, if we have it, for compliance, and I didn't, but it came, the very first hit was NIST compliance means follow the best practices that NIST is developing. It doesn't mean go run west, because the guidance is it's telling you to go that way. You have to determine, do you run the right way? Do you run at your speed? Do you optimize the process? It's all, are you accomplishing what you want to accomplish? Mm-hmm. So I think that is very important for all of us to understand the context in which you are discussing. If we need to agree or not that compliance is important, compliance is security if you apply it the right way and you have a clear understanding. And that's all I wanted to start with a conversation today.
Hi, Chris. I'm Brady Wetland. I work at Trillion Technology Solutions. I thought it was interesting, the milestones for FedRAMP that you showed up there. Yeah. Besides NIST compliance being further refined and defined and explained and educated to this environment, to these people that are doing this type of work, what other milestones do you see for the future of FedRAMP?
Again, I don't speak on the behalf of the FedRAMP program or GSA, but I think like if you want to see where it's headed is looking at that modernization memo, the emerging technologies framework, and see things that they're prioritizing. The GRC platform solicitation, for example. I imagine we're going to see, FedRAMP shift to a new GRC platform that's more innovative and does some of the things I talked about from an API perspective, pipeline, cloud native integration perspective. I hope we'll see that happen. I hope we'll see refinement of the way we do ConMon to be more dynamic, real-time, risk-focused versus static and snapshot in time. But again, I don't speak on their behalf. I'm just advocating for these changes as someone who operates in the ecosystem.
Hi, I'm Terry Prince, the CEO of the Terita Companies. I guess I can speak a little bit about FedRAMP since we're the only one to run the whole FedRAMP gauntlet, 2018 readiness, 2020 readiness, and 2023. Finally, we found somebody to take us to ATO, and honored that it is the United States Senate. And having gone through it, I can tell you that it is an enormous effort for a company like ours, 10 people, but it can be done. It isn't rocket science. It is just doing a proper job of looking at the controls, moving through them properly, and finding your way through. And in my opinion, with the kind of work that we've been doing and our ability to use inherited controls from AWS, because we've been here when we rewrote our application in the first place. And I see my initial contact here, Karen, when we did pre-readiness with Coalfire in 2017 and rewrote our application. I guess what I'd like to say is that it is a horrible process. It's managed badly, but we shouldn't knock the credential for the process. And in my opinion, our goal is to take 1,000 companies through this year, and I think it can be done with the help of our AWS partners and everybody here who wants to do it. But if you're interested, come and talk to us. We sure have enough experience. And it looks like we know a lot of the people in this room. And I apologize for my inability to walk this week, but
No, you're fine. I think, another thing that she pointed out is a pain point is like the need for a sponsor. It's kind of a chicken and egg scenario where you need a sponsor to take you through the FedRAMP process, but the government buyer won't use you if you aren't in the federal FedRAMP marketplace. So that's a big impediment that needs to be addressed from the FedRAMP PMO perspective, in my opinion. And then, obviously she talked about, the process and it being painful for a small business of 10 people. The reality is that's the truth. And it's going to be the truth that maybe the federal ecosystem or the federal market isn't appropriate for every company. Maybe if you don't have the resources or you don't have the tolerance for that level of assurance, the federal market might not be right for you, but it's a dichotomy between that and the government having access to innovative technologies and suppliers. So we're trying to get that balancing act. And I think we'll hear a lot about that today.